I wasn't looking for buried cities. I was trying to understand a window, a basement window, specifically, in a municipal building in Cincinnati, Ohio. The building dates to 1855, or at least that's the year inscribed above the entrance. Limestone facade, Italianate detailing, 4 stories visible from the street, standard mid-19th century civic construction. The kind of building you walk past 1,000 times without registering. I had walked past it for years, and then one afternoon, for reasons I still can't fully articulate, I stopped and looked down. Below the sidewalk, separated from the pavement by a narrow iron grate, there was a window. Not a ventilation shaft, not a utility access panel. A window with a carved stone lintel with decorative molding that matched the ornamentation of the floors above. A window that had clearly, unmistakably, been designed to let light into a room that was now entirely underground. I crouched down. Through the grate and the grime, I could see it. A full story beneath the current street level. Walls of dressed stone, the remnants of a floor, the proportions of a space that was never intended to be a basement. It had the ceiling height, the fenestration, the architectural grammar of a ground floor, and it was buried. That should have been a simple observation. Every old city has subsidence, fill operations, grade changes. Streets get raised, buildings settle, infrastructure accumulates in layers. I knew all of that. I had read the engineering explanations, and for a long time they satisfied me. But then I started counting, not just in Cincinnati, everywhere. Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Chicago, obviously, where the entire downtown was famously raised by 4 to 14 feet in the 1850s and 1860s, a project of staggering ambition that we're told was undertaken to solve a drainage problem. Salt Lake City, Sacramento, Atlanta, Kansas City, Louisville, city after city, continent after continent. In Manchester, England, buried ground floors visible through iron gratings along Deansgate. In Melbourne, Australia, excavations for modern utilities routinely expose finished rooms, tiled floors, full window frames beneath the current street grade. In St. Petersburg, Russia, an entire stratum of civic architecture sits partially submerged. The lower stories of buildings dating to the early 1700s now reading as basements, despite bearing every structural and decorative signature of a principal floor. The pattern repeats with a precision that I found, and continue to find, deeply unsettling. Let me be specific about what I mean by pattern, because precision matters here. I'm not talking about buildings that gradually sank into soft ground over decades. I'm not talking about the slow, well-documented geological process of alluvial deposition in river cities. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about buildings whose lower floors appear to have been buried rapidly, uniformly, and across vast geographical distances within the same approximate historical window, roughly the first half of the 19th century, sometimes earlier. Buildings where the buried story retains its original finishes, its plastered walls, its decorative stonework, its window glass, as if it wasn't abandoned gradually, but sealed, as if something came down and covered it, or as if the world around it rose while it stayed where it was. And here's the part that first made me set down my notes and sit in silence for a very long time. In many of these buildings, the buried floor is the most finely constructed. The stonework is superior. The proportions are grander. The craftsmanship exceeds what's visible above, as if the building was designed from the bottom up with its most important spaces at ground level. And what we see today, what we walk into, what we treat as the entrance, is in fact the second story of a structure whose true ground floor has been quietly, systematically put underground. This raises a question I did not expect to be asking. If the buried floors are the original ground floors, then what is the current ground? Where did it come from? And when? I want to spend a moment on Chicago because it's the city most often cited to dismiss the buried floor phenomenon. and I think that's precisely backward. I think Chicago is the most revealing case we have. The official history is well known. In the 1850s, the city was plagued by standing water, poor drainage, and outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. The solution, engineered primarily by Ellis Chesbrough, was to raise the grade of the entire downtown by an average of 6 to 8 feet, and in some areas by as much as 14. Buildings were either jacked up on thousands of jack screws and new foundations built beneath them, or they were simply left at the old grade and the streets rose around them, entombing their ground floors. This is presented as a triumph of American ingenuity, and in many ways, it was. But sit with the scale of it for a moment. Thousands of buildings, miles of streetscape, entire city blocks lifted simultaneously while businesses continued to operate inside them. This was the 1850s. Horsepower, hand tools, and jack screws. The labor force required would have been extraordinary. The coordination would have rivaled a military campaign. And yet, the documentation is strangely thin on specifics. We have the broad narrative. We have a few celebrated episodes, George Pullman raising the Tremont House, the British tourists who allegedly didn't notice their hotel was being elevated while they slept. But we lack the kind of granular engineering records that a project of this magnitude should have generated. Where are the detailed foundation surveys? Where are the soil analysis reports? Where are the material requisition logs for the thousands of tons of fill that would have been required? They're fragmentary, incomplete, lost, we're told, in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which conveniently destroyed much of the municipal archive just 2 decades after the grade-raising project. And I want to be careful here. Fires happen, records are lost, cities have short institutional memories. But the timing is difficult to set aside. A massive infrastructure project of debatable explanation, followed 20 years later by a fire that consumes the records that would have documented it in detail. The same pattern of thin documentation I've observed in every other city with buried architecture. And here's what the Chicago narrative doesn't explain. If the grade raising was a deliberate engineering project, why do the buried floors of pre-raised buildings show the same superior construction quality I've observed in Cincinnati, in St. Petersburg, in Melbourne? Why does the architecture below the new grade consistently exceed the architecture above it? If these buildings were constructed at the original grade and then lifted or buried by a known, planned project, the quality should be uniform throughout. The fact that it isn't suggests that the buried floors may predate the buildings above them, that what was raised or adapted was not the original structure, but something added on top of it. The standard explanations are not unreasonable, taken individually. Cities raised their grades to improve drainage and sanitation. The Chicago example is well documented in broad strokes. Sacramento did something similar after catastrophic floods in the 1860s. These are historical facts. I don't dispute them. But the explanations work only when applied locally. They collapse under their own weight the moment you try to apply them globally. Chicago had a drainage problem. Fine. But Cincinnati, St. Petersburg, Melbourne, Kolkata, Buenos Aires? Did every major city on Earth independently decide, within the same 50-year period, to raise its street level by 8 to 15 feet? Bury its finest ground floor architecture, and then never discuss it again in any coordinated way? The silence around this question is not the silence of disinterest. It's the silence of an answer that no one wants to be the first to give. I spent months going through municipal records in 3 cities, looking for the construction documentation that should accompany a project as massive as raising an entire city's grade by 10 feet. In each case, what I found was fragmentary, partial budgets, references to improvements without specifications, contracts awarded to firms whose records no longer exist, meeting minutes that summarize decisions without recording the deliberation. The paper trail is thin in exactly the way it's thin when something has been selectively preserved. when someone decided what future researchers would and wouldn't be permitted to reconstruct. This isn't active suppression. I want to be clear about that. I'm not describing a conspiracy of document shredders operating across 3 continents. I'm describing something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. I'm describing the kind of passive erasure that happens when certain questions simply cease to be asked, when an explanation is accepted not because it's sufficient, but because the alternative is too architecturally uncomfortable to entertain. And then there are the ornaments. This is where my investigation took a turn I did not anticipate. And if you'll bear with me, I think you'll understand why. Look at the roof lines of civic buildings from the 1800s. Not the grand cathedrals, not the palaces. I'll come to those. I mean the post offices, the courthouses, the train stations, the libraries. Look at what's on top of them. Metal finials, spires, cupolas sheathed in copper, iron cresting running along the ridge lines, acroteria at the gable ends, often in metal, often elaborately formed, often connected by visible metalwork to the structure below. We're told these are decorative elements, architectural fashion, the Victorian love of ornament. I accepted that for years, and then I started looking at the engineering. The copper domes on civic buildings across North America and Europe are not structurally necessary. No engineer would add that weight and expense purely for weather protection when simpler roofing would serve. Yet they appear everywhere, and they appear with a consistency that goes beyond fashion. The dome sits atop the building's most central structural mass. It is almost always connected to the building's foundation by internal metalwork, iron columns, copper flashing, that runs the full height of the structure, creating an uninterrupted, conductive path from the metal ornament at the apex to the stone and earth below. Look closer. The spires on courthouses, on state capitals, on municipal buildings across the world. Not church steeples, those have their own theological justification. I mean the spires on secular buildings, pointed, metal-tipped, often gilded, rising from the highest point of the structure, connected again to internal metal framework that descends through the building into its foundation, into the ground. Why would a post office need a spire? The official answer is always the same: civic pride, aesthetic ambition, the architectural language of authority. And maybe that's true. Maybe thousands of municipalities across dozens of countries, speaking different languages, operating under different governments, all independently decided to place elaborate metal structures on top of their civic buildings for purely decorative reasons, all at roughly the same time, all using the same materials, all with the same internal structural logic of a continuous conductive path from apex to earth. Or maybe the ornaments weren't ornaments. I want to be careful here because this is where the investigation moves from observation into interpretation, and I owe you the honesty of marking that boundary. What I'm about to describe is my reading of the physical evidence, not a conclusion I can prove in a laboratory. But the evidence is physical. It's measurable. It's there for anyone willing to look. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a body of engineering literature, not fringe material, published work by credentialed researchers that discussed the relationship between architectural metalwork and atmospheric energy. The term used most frequently was atmospheric electricity, a known physical phenomenon. The Earth's atmosphere carries an electrical charge. The potential difference between the ground and the upper atmosphere is measurable and substantial. Anyone who has watched lightning understands the principle. What these researchers were investigating was whether architectural structures, specifically tall metal-tipped structures connected to the Earth through conductive pathways, could harness that potential difference in some controlled, functional manner. Nikola Tesla spoke openly about this. His Wardenclyffe Tower, constructed in 1901 on Long Island, was explicitly designed to transmit energy through the Earth and atmosphere. We're told the project failed. we're told it was financially unviable. The tower was demolished in 1917 to pay debts, and that, according to the standard account, was the end of atmospheric energy research as a serious engineering pursuit. But here's what I find difficult to reconcile. Tesla was building a prototype of something, a first attempt, an experiment. If the underlying physics were nonsense, there would have been no experiment to attempt. If the concept of drawing usable energy from the atmosphere through a grounded metallic structure were pure fantasy, it wouldn't have attracted the investment it attracted, the attention it attracted, the institutional alarm it attracted. And when I look at the thousands of civic buildings erected in the decades before Tesla, buildings whose spires and domes and copper-clad cupolas create exactly the kind of structural geometry Tesla was experimenting with, I find it very difficult to believe those are coincidences. I'm not saying every courthouse in Ohio was a power station. I'm saying the architectural language suggests a functional vocabulary that we've been taught to read as purely aesthetic, and that the physical properties of these structures are consistent with a technology we've been told never existed. Now I want to connect these threads, because separately they're curiosities. Together, they begin to form a shape. We have buildings whose buried ground floors suggest a different original relationship to the Earth's surface. We have architectural metalwork that creates continuous conductive paths from atmospheric exposure points to the ground. We have a historical window, roughly 1800 to 1900, in which these features appear globally, with a uniformity that transcends cultural, linguistic, and political boundaries. And we have, immediately preceding this window, the events I explored in the previous installment of this series, the atmospheric catastrophe of 1816. The disappearance of a vast territorial entity from the cartographic record, the orphaned infrastructure that appears in city after city without adequate construction documentation, the pattern of buildings that seem to predate the communities they supposedly serve. What if the buried floors aren't the result of cities being raised? What if they're the result of something coming down? A depositional event, a layer of material, a debris field settling across the surface of the Earth in the aftermath of whatever happened in 1816, covering the ground floors of existing structures, raising the effective grade by 8, 10, 15 feet in some locations. Not gradually, not through natural alluvial processes, rapidly, catastrophically, in a manner consistent with the kind of atmospheric event that turns summer into winter and produces what multiple contemporary accounts described as dry fog, persistent haze, and particulate fallout that lasted for months. I know how that sounds. I know that it invites a certain kind of dismissal, but I would ask anyone inclined to dismiss it to first explain Melbourne, explain St. Petersburg, explain why buried ground floors of comparable depth and condition appear on every inhabited continent within the same historical period. Explain why the buried story is routinely the finest. Explain why the construction records are thin in every case. Explain why the same cities that exhibit buried architecture also feature civic buildings with the same metallic structural vocabulary, as if the two phenomena are related, as if the buildings were originally designed to interact with the ground. That is now their buried first floor. I can't prove the connection, but I can observe it. And I can tell you that after 2 years of looking at this evidence, the coincidence explanation has become the one that requires the most faith. There is a deeper question beneath all of this, and I've been avoiding it because it's the one that, once spoken aloud, reorganizes everything else. Who built these buildings? The standard answer is straightforward. The people of the era built them. American settlers built the American ones. British colonists built the colonial ones. Russian craftsmen built the Russian ones. Each city, each nation, independently producing civic architecture of astonishing scale and uniformity, using the technologies of the day. But the technologies of the day don't account for what's actually there. Consider what it would take to build In 1855, a limestone municipal building with a buried ground floor of superior construction, an above-grade facade of meticulous Italianate detailing, a copper-clad cupola housing internal metalwork running the full height of the structure, and foundation stones dressed to tolerances that would challenge modern equipment. In a frontier city, with a population of perhaps 100,000, while simultaneously building similar structures in every other American city of comparable size, and doing so within the same decade. The supply chains don't work. The labor pools don't work. The timelines don't work. I've gone through census records, immigration data, municipal budgets, trying to reconstruct the workforce that supposedly produced the built environment of mid-19th century America, and the numbers collapse under scrutiny. There aren't enough skilled stonemasons. There aren't enough quarries operating at the required output. There aren't enough rail lines to transport the material. The math doesn't add up. It never adds up. And yet the buildings stand. In my view, and I want to emphasize that this is my personal analysis based on years of accumulated evidence, the simplest explanation is not the official one. The simplest explanation is that many of these structures were already there, that the communities we credit with building them were in fact inheriting them, adapting them, claiming them the way any society claims the infrastructure it finds itself living inside, that the buried ground floors represent the original grade of a previous occupancy, covered over by whatever event disrupted the transition between what was here before and what came after. This would explain the uniformity, not thousands of independent communities all building identical civic architecture simultaneously, but a single inherited building stock, distributed globally, adapted locally, its origins steadily obscured by the passage of time and the accumulation of new narratives. It would explain the missing records. You can't produce construction documentation for something you didn't construct. You can only produce appropriation narratives, dedication dates, and ceremonial plaques that mark the moment you claimed what was already standing. And it would explain the ornaments. If these buildings were constructed by a civilization with a working understanding of atmospheric energy, a civilization whose architectural vocabulary was functional rather than merely decorative, then the spires and domes and copper cresting aren't excesses of Victorian taste. Passages that describe the cupola as an active element of the building's environmental system, without elaborating on what that system does. And then, by 1910, those references disappear from the textbooks entirely. The same structures are described in purely aesthetic terms. The functional vocabulary is gone, replaced by words like grandeur and civic aspiration, and the language of classical authority. Something was known, and then it wasn't. Not because the knowledge was proven wrong, but because the context in which it made sense had been removed. Like reading an electrical schematic after someone has told you it's a decorative pattern. The lines are all there, the connections are visible, but without the interpretive framework, they mean nothing. Or they mean whatever you've been told they mean. And consider the timing. The vocabulary shift in architectural literature from functional to purely aesthetic descriptions of these metallic structural elements occurs in precisely the same decades when electrical utilities were being centralized, when power generation moved from distributed, local systems to large-scale industrial plants, controlled by a small number of corporations. When the economics of energy changed fundamentally, from something potentially ambient and architectural to something metered, sold, and monopolized. The transition in the textbooks mirrors, almost exactly, the transition in the economy. I don't think that's accidental. I think one facilitated the other. The buildings still stand. That's the part I can't get past. The copper domes still sit atop municipal halls in 100 cities. The iron cresting still runs along roof lines from Savannah to Vladivostok. The spires still point at the sky. The buried floors still hold their window glass beneath sidewalks where 1 million people walk without looking down. Every component of the original system remains in place. What's missing is only the understanding of what the system was for. I keep returning to that window in Cincinnati. Carved lintel, decorative molding, glass still partially intact after what may be a century and a half underground. A window that was designed to let light into a room where people worked, where decisions were made, where the life of a city passed through on ordinary afternoons. Now it sits below a sidewalk, behind an iron grate in the dark. No one lied about that window. No one fabricated its existence. It is simply there, and it is simply not discussed. It doesn't appear in the building's current architectural description. It isn't noted in the city's heritage records. It exists in the space between what is documented and what is visible. And anyone who walks by can see it, and almost no one does. That, more than any single piece of evidence, is what I think about when I think about how a civilization gets forgotten. Not through dramatic acts of destruction, not through fires and conquests and the deliberate erasure of libraries, though those happen too, but through the quieter, more permanent process of simply ceasing to notice, of walking over the evidence every day and never looking down, of inheriting buildings whose purpose you've been taught to misread, and then teaching your children the same misreading, until the misreading becomes the only reading anyone remembers. Why are the buried floors always the finest? Why does the metalwork connect the sky to the earth? Why do the same structural principles appear in buildings separated by oceans and languages and centuries of supposedly independent development? Why are the construction records thin in every case, in every city, on every continent? Why do the textbooks change their vocabulary at the exact historical moment when the functional framework would have become most visible? Why does the shift in architectural language coincide so precisely with the centralization of energy production? I don't have answers. I have observations. I have measurements and photographs and municipal records and architectural specifications that don't add up, that have never added up, that nobody asks to add up because the asking itself feels inappropriate. Feels like a breach of some unspoken agreement about which questions are permitted and which are not. The buildings don't care about that agreement. The buildings remember. The stone remembers the hands that dressed it. The copper remembers the charge it carried. The buried windows remember the light. We're the ones who've forgotten, and we walk over the evidence every single day. If you've made it this far, I'll ask one thing. The next time you're in an old city, any old city, look down. Look at the sidewalk grates. Look at the half windows below street level. Look at the stonework that disappears beneath the pavement. And ask yourself the question that nobody in the municipal records ever thought to ask, or if they did, chose not to write down. What's beneath us? What was here before the ground we're standing on became the ground? And who decided we weren't supposed to notice? I'll see you in the next one.